Imagine a world where books are so rare that a king might trade a castle for just one. Imagine a time when the ability to read was like a superpower, possessed only by a tiny handful of people. It is hard for us to picture this today because we live in a world overflowing with information. We have schools in every neighbourhood and universities in every major city. We have libraries and the internet at our fingertips. But have you ever stopped to ask where this culture of learning came from? How did we get from a world of tribes and warriors to a world of scholars and scientists? The answer might surprise some people in our modern secular world, but history tells a very clear story. The bridge between the ancient world and the modern mind was built largely by the Christian faith. It was not an accident. It was a direct result of what Christians believe about God and the world. Let us go back to the time after the fall of the Rome. Often people call this the Dark Ages. They imagine it was a time of total ignorance. But in reality, there were lights flickering in the darkness. Those lights were the monasteries. When the great empire collapsed and armies were marching across Europe burning cities, it was the Christian monks who retreated to quiet places to save the treasures of the past. They did not just save the Bible. They saved the works of literature and history and philosophy from Greece and Rome. If it were not for these monks, we would likely know almost nothing about the ancient world today. Picture a monk sitting at a wooden desk in a cold stone room. It is winter and his fingers are stiff. He has only a candle for light. Day after day, year after year, he carefully copies text from an old crumbling scroll onto fresh parchment. He is copying the Gospel of John, but the next day he might be copying a book on mathematics or astronomy. He does this because he believes that all truth is God's truth. He believes that by preserving knowledge, he is honouring the Creator who gave us minds to think. These monasteries became the first real libraries of Europe. They were safe havens where learning was cherished while chaos reigned outside. But the church did not just hide knowledge away. They eventually wanted to share it. This desire to organise learning led to one of the greatest inventions in human history, which is the university. Most people do not realise that the university is a distinctly Christian creation. The very first universities in places like Bologna and Paris and Oxford grew out of cathedral schools. The church needed a place to train clergy, but they also wanted to understand law and medicine and logic. The University of Paris was famous for philosophy and theology. The University of Bologna was famous for law. These institutions were chartered by the Pope. The robes that professors wear today at graduation ceremonies are actually patterned after the robes of medieval priests. The idea of getting a degree comes from the church granting a license to teach. So every time a student walks across a stage to get a diploma today, they are participating in a tradition that started in the heart of the church. You might hear people say that faith and reason are enemies. They say you have to choose between the Bible and science. But history shows us the exact opposite. The scientific revolution did not happen in spite of Christianity. It happened largely because of Christianity. The early scientists were not atheists trying to disprove God. They were deep believers who wanted to understand how God built the universe. Think about a man like Isaac Newton. We know him for gravity and the laws of motion. But Newton wrote more about theology and the Bible than he did about physics. He looked at the order in the solar system and he saw the hand of a master architect. He believed that the universe followed laws because a lawgiver had created it. If you believe the world is just a random accident, you might not expect to find consistent laws of nature. But if you believe in a rational God who does not change, then you expect nature to make sense. That belief drove the explosion of scientific discovery. There was also a monk named Gregor Mendel. He is the father of modern genetics. He spent his life in a garden at a monastery carefully studying pea plants. He discovered how traits are passed down from parents to offspring. He was a man of prayer doing science in the service of truth. Or think about Louis Pasteur, who gave us the process of pasteurization and vaccines. He was a devout Christian. He did not see a conflict between his microscope and his prayer book. This educational drive was not just for the elite. One of the biggest shifts happened during the Reformation. Before this time, most people could not read. They relied on priests to tell them what was in the Bible. But the Reformers believed that every person should be able to read the Word of God for themselves. This was a revolutionary idea. It meant that a ploughboy in the field needed to be literate just as much as a prince in the palace. This belief sparked a massive push for literacy. Schools were started in villages that never had them before. In places like Scotland and Germany, and eventually America, the church pushed for laws requiring parents to send their children to school. They did this primarily so children could read the Bible, but once you learn to read the Bible, you can read anything. You can read a contract. You can read a newspaper. You can read a book on farming or history. The spiritual motivation had a massive practical benefit for all of society. When the Puritans came to America, one of the first things they did was build schools. They founded Harvard just a few years after arriving. They stated clearly that they did not want an illiterate ministry when the current leaders died. Over 100 of the first colleges in America were founded by Christian denominations. Yale and Princeton and Dartmouth and Brown all have Christian roots. They were started by people who believed that training the mind was a way to glorify God. We also have to talk about the Sunday school movement. In the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution was changing the world. Children were working in factories 6 days a week. They had no time for school and most were illiterate. A man named Robert Raikes saw this tragedy. He started a school on Sundays, which was the only day the children had off. He taught them to read and write using the Bible as a textbook. This movement swept across England and then the world. For millions of poor children, Sunday school was the only education they ever received. It was the church that stepped in to teach the poor when the government was doing nothing. This pattern continued all over the world. During the great era of missions in the 19th and 20th centuries, missionaries went to Africa and Asia and South America. They went to preach the gospel, but they almost always built a clinic and a school right next to the church. In many African nations, the first written form of their language was created by Christian missionaries. They listened to the spoken language and created an alphabet and wrote dictionaries so the people could read. In countries like India and China, missionaries established some of the finest schools and hospitals. They believed that Jesus cared about the whole person. He cared about their soul, but he also cared about their mind and their body. Education was seen as an act of love. It was a way to lift people out of poverty and ignorance. Even today in many developing nations, the best schools are often those run by religious orders. Let us look at the concept of the book itself. Christianity is often called a religion of the book. Because the Bible is written text, Christians have always placed a high value on the written word. This focus on text helped standardize languages. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, it helped unify the many different German dialects into one standard language. The same thing happened with the King James Bible in English. It shaped the way we speak and write for centuries. It is also important to remember who started the education of women in many places. In the ancient world and in many other cultures, educating girls was considered a waste of time. But Christians believed that women had souls equal to men and needed to read the Bible just as much. This conviction led to the founding of schools for girls long before secular society caught up. In the 19th century, it was often Christian organizations that pioneered higher education for women, opening colleges specifically for them. Consider the education of the deaf. For a long time, people who were born deaf were considered unteachable. They were cast aside by society. But there was a French priest named Charles Michel de Lespée. He looked at the deaf children in the streets of Paris and he felt compassion. He believed they could learn. He developed a system of sign language that became the basis for the sign language we use today. He founded the first public school for the hearing impaired. He did this because he wanted them to know God. But in doing so, he opened up the world of communication for millions of people. Or think about the education of the blind. Louis Braille, who invented the system of reading for the blind, was a dedicated Christian. He wanted to be able to read, but he also wanted to help others. He once said that living without seeing is not the problem, but living without hope is. His faith gave him the hope to create a tool that has educated countless blind people around the globe. The arguments are all around us if we look. The very structure of our week revolves around a pattern of rest that comes from faith. The holidays we celebrate often mark the school calendar. But deeper than that is the idea of objective truth. Christianity teaches that truth exists and that it can be found. In a world that is becoming more and more confused about what is true, the Christian foundation of education reminds us that there is a reality outside of our own feelings. Education requires humility. You have to admit that you do not know everything in order to learn. This is a very Christian virtue. The Bible teaches that pride comes before a fall. The great Christian scholars of the past approached their studies with humility. They sat at the feet of the masters. They learned the grammar and the logic before they tried to develop their own new theories. This discipline of the mind is something that the Church cultivated for centuries. We can also look at the arts. Music education was heavily driven by the Church. The system of musical notation we use today was developed by a monk named Guido of Arezzo. He needed a way to teach the choir how to sing the chants correctly. So he invented the staff and the notes. Every time a child learns to read music today, they are using a system developed to praise God. The great composers like Bach and Handel and Mozart wrote their greatest works for the Church. To perform these works, musicians had to be highly trained. This created a demand for music education that continues to this day. Art education also owes a debt to the Church. For centuries, the Church was the primary patron of the arts. They hired painters and sculptors to tell the stories of the Bible in visual form for those who could not read. This required the training of apprentices. The great masters taught their students how to mix paints and how to understand perspective. The beauty of the cathedrals themselves taught the common people about geometry and light and proportion. Let us think about the preservation of history again. The Bible is a book of history. It tells the story of real people in real places. Because of this, Christians have always been interested in history. A monk named the Venerable Bede is known as the father of English history. He wrote the first major history of the English people. Without his work, the early history of England would be a mist. He did this work from a monastery in Jarrow. He was careful to check his sources and record things accurately. He set a standard for historical writing that is still respected. Even the concept of human rights, which is discussed in political science and law schools everywhere, has Christian roots. The idea that every human being has dignity and rights comes from the belief that we are made in the image of God. If we are just random collections of atoms, there is no reason why the strong should not dominate the weak. But if we are children of God, then every person matters. This idea was radical in the Roman Empire. It changed the laws. It changed how people were treated. And it became the foundation for the modern understanding of liberty and justice. When we look at the timeline of human progress, we see a distinct acceleration where the influence of the gospel went. It was not always perfect. Christians have made mistakes. There were times when religious leaders opposed new ideas. But those are the exceptions that prove the rule. The overwhelming trend of history is that where the Church went, schools followed. Where the Bible was opened, minds were opened. In the United States, the movement to abolish slavery was driven by educated Christians. They used their literacy and their knowledge of the Bible to argue that slavery was a sin. They wrote books and pamphlets. They gave speeches. They educated the public about the horrors of the slave trade. People like William Wilberforce in England and the abolitionists in America were motivated by their faith to change the world. They understood that a society based on oppression could not stand. Their education was a weapon for justice. Let's also talk about the specific subject of logic. Logic is the art of thinking clearly. In the medieval universities, logic was one of the first things a student learned. They studied the works of Aristotle, but they applied Christian theology to it. They sharpened their minds to detect errors in reasoning. This training in logic is what allowed later thinkers to develop the scientific method. The scientific method is basically applied logic. You form a hypothesis, and you test it, and you draw a conclusion. This rigorous way of thinking was nurtured in the classrooms of the church. We often take for granted that children are valuable. In ancient pagan societies, unwanted children were often left outside to die. This was a common practice. The early Christians were known for rescuing these children. They took them in and raised them. They taught them. This respect for the life of the child is the foundation of pediatrics and early childhood education. The idea that a child is a person with potential who deserves care and instruction is a gift from the Judeo-Christian worldview. In the modern world, we sometimes see a drift away from these roots. Universities that were founded to train ministers now sometimes mock the faith of their founders. But they are still using the capital that was built up by centuries of Christian investment. They are living in the house that faith built. The very freedom to question and to explore comes from a worldview that values the individual mind. Consider the global impact of English. English is the language of global business and science. This spread of English was largely due to the British Empire and America, both deeply influenced by Christianity. But it was also due to the Bible. The King James Bible and the works of Shakespeare, who was writing in a Christian culture, shaped the language. When people around the world learn English today, they are learning a language that is saturated with biblical idioms and metaphors. Phrases like the writing on the wall, or a drop in the bucket, or the salt of the earth, all come from the Bible. You cannot fully understand English literature without understanding the Bible. We should also mention the field of archaeology. Many of the first archaeologists were Christians looking for evidence of the Bible's stories. They went to the Middle East and began digging. They discovered lost cities and civilizations. They developed the techniques of careful excavation. Their desire to confirm the biblical record led to the discovery of the history of the entire ancient Near East. We know about the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Babylonians largely because people wanted to understand the world of the Bible. Even the concept of charity, which is often taught in social work programs, is Christian. The pagan world had no concept of charity as a virtue. If someone was poor, it was thought to be their fate. But Christians believed that giving to the poor was giving to God. This led to the creation of orphanages and old age homes. These were the first institutions of social welfare. They were the training grounds for the professions of social work and nursing. The influence is so vast it is like asking a fish to describe water. It is everywhere. It is in the calendar we use, which splits history into before Christ and after. It is in the holidays we get off work. It is in the names of our hospitals, like St. Jude or St. Mary. It is in the mottos of our universities. Oxford's motto is, "The Lord is my light." Harvard's original motto was, "Truth for Christ and the Church." These are not coincidences. They are markers of origin. So when we ask how Christianity educated the world, the answer is comprehensive. It provided the physical places for learning in monasteries and schools. It provided the motivation for learning by teaching that God is rational and wants to be known. It provided the tools for learning like books and alphabets and musical notation. And it provided the moral framework for learning by teaching humility and service. This is not to say that only Christians have ever learned anything. The Greeks and Romans had great scholars. The Islamic world had a golden age of learning. But the specific institutions and the sustained momentum that created the modern educational system of the West, which has now spread to the entire world, came from the Christian soil. The continuous chain of universities and the mass literacy of the common people are distinct legacies of the faith. Today, if you can read this, you owe a debt to this history. If you have ever taken a medicine that cured you, you owe a debt to the scientific method nurtured by believers. If you have ever enjoyed a piece of beautiful music, you are enjoying a tradition that started in the choir lofts of cathedrals. The story of education is the story of light spreading. And for centuries, the fuel for that light was the Christian faith. It was the belief that we are not accidents, but created beings with a purpose. And part of that purpose is to grow and to learn and to understand the marvelous work of the Creator. We can look at the simple fact of the durability of books. Parchment and vellum were expensive and durable. Christians chose the codex, which is the book form with pages you turn, over the scroll. The scroll was hard to use. You had to unroll it to find what you wanted. The codex allowed you to flip to a specific page. This seems like a small thing, but it was a huge technological leap for information. It made looking up information much faster. Christians adopted this format early because they were constantly cross-referencing scriptures. They needed to compare the Old Testament prophecies with the New Testament fulfillments. This practical need drove the adoption of the book format that we still use today. Think about the sheer number of languages that exist. There are thousands. For many of these languages, the only book that has ever been translated into them is the Bible. This means that for those cultures, the Bible is their only connection to the written word. It is their primer for reading. It is their encyclopedia. It is their library. The work of Bible translators is one of the greatest educational achievements in human history. They tackle complex grammatical puzzles to bring the written word to remote tribes. This is education at its most fundamental level. There is also the aspect of discipline. Learning is hard. It requires sitting still. It requires focus. It requires delaying gratification. These are virtues that the Church taught. The monks followed a strict schedule called the divine office. They learned to control their impulses. This discipline of the self is crucial for any kind of serious study. You cannot become a master of physics or a master of the violin without discipline. The culture of discipline that pervaded the Christian life spilled over into the culture of study. We can look at the architecture of the libraries. The great libraries of the world are often built like cathedrals. They have high ceilings and stained glass and hushed atmospheres. This is because the library is a sacred space. It is a temple of knowledge. This reverence for books is a spiritual attitude. It treats the thoughts of the past as something precious to be guarded. When we walk into a library today, we are walking into a space that mimics the church because the two were once one and the same. In the field of economics, the early church fathers and later the scholastics debated about fair prices and usury. They thought deeply about what makes an economy just. These debates were the early seeds of economic theory. They were asking moral questions about money. While modern economics often tries to separate itself from morality, the roots of the discussion go back to theologians trying to apply God's law to the marketplace. We must also consider the role of the family. Christianity placed a huge emphasis on the family as the primary school. The father and mother were instructed to teach their children. "Train up a child in the way he should go," says the proverb. This focus on the home as a centre of learning created a culture where education was valued from the cradle. It was not just something for the state to do, it was a parental duty. This is why homeschooling has such a strong tradition within the Christian community. It is a return to the ancient idea that parents are the first teachers. The very idea of a curriculum comes from a Latin word meaning a racecourse. It implies a path to be run, a structured progression. The medieval church developed the trivium and the quadrivium. These were the 7 liberal arts. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric were the trivium. Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy were the quadrivium. This was the standard curriculum for centuries. It was designed to produce a free man, a person who could think for himself. We still use the term liberal arts today. It means the arts of liberty, the skills you need to be a free citizen. This structure was the backbone of Western education. Let us not forget the role of Christian humanism. During the Renaissance, scholars like Erasmus wanted to go back to the original sources. They wanted to read the New Testament in Greek, not just the Latin translation. This drive for accuracy and original sources improved scholarship immensely. It taught people not to just accept what they were told, but to check the evidence. Erasmus remained a faithful Christian while pushing for intellectual reform. He showed that you could be critical and devout at the same time. In the realm of law, the influence is profound. The concept of natural law, that there are laws higher than the king, is a theological concept. It means that the king is not God. The king is subject to God's law just like the peasant. This idea is what limits the power of tyrants. It is what allows for the rule of law rather than the rule of might. The great legal scholars of history like Blackstone often quoted the Bible in their commentaries. They saw human law as an attempt to mirror the divine justice. So when you sit in a classroom, or read a book, or sign a contract, or vote in an election, or go to a doctor, you are interacting with a system that was watered and pruned by the Christian faith for 2,000 years. It is a legacy of light. It is a legacy of believing that the world is real, that it makes sense, and that we have the privilege of understanding it. It is a legacy that says every mind is precious because every soul is eternal. The story is long and it has many chapters, but the main theme is clear. The faith that began with a carpenter from Nazareth who taught in parables has become the greatest teacher the world has ever known. It did not just teach people how to pray. It taught them how to think. It taught them how to read. It taught them how to care for the sick and the poor. It taught them how to build and how to sing and how to live together in peace. That is the true education of Christianity. It is an education of the whole human race. And perhaps the most important lesson it taught is that knowledge is not an end in itself. Knowledge is for service. You learn so that you can help. You learn so that you can love your neighbour better. A doctor learns medicine to heal. A lawyer learns law to defend. A builder learns engineering to shelter. This idea of service is the heart of the Christian message. The greatest among you shall be the servant of all. Education is the tool that allows us to serve more effectively. It turns a willing heart into a capable hand. As we look to the future, we face new challenges. Technology is changing everything, but the old principles still apply. We still need truth. We still need humility. We still need to believe that human beings have dignity. The roots that supported the tree of knowledge in the past are the same roots we need today. If we cut ourselves off from them, the tree might wither. But if we nurture them, who knows what new fruits of learning and discovery we might yet see. The story of how Christianity educated the world is not just history, it is a continuing story. And we are the ones writing the next chapter. The invitation is for everyone to look deeper. Do not just accept the surface-level narrative that religion promotes ignorance. Look at the stones of the universities. Look at the names on the hospitals. Look at the history of the books on your shelf. The evidence is there. It speaks of a faith that loves the light. It speaks of a God who says, "Come now, and let us reason together." It is a beautiful heritage, and it is one that belongs to all of us who treasure the life of the mind. Think of the countless anonymous teachers in Sunday schools, in mission stations, in parish schools. They never became famous. They never wrote bestsellers. But they taught a child to read. They taught a child that they mattered. They planted seeds that grew into forests. This is the quiet, steady work of the church. It does not always make the headlines, but it makes history. It builds civilization block by block, lesson by lesson, student by student. So the next time you open a book, take a moment to remember the monk with the candle. Remember the reformer with the printing press. Remember the missionary with the alphabet. Remember the scientist with the prayer book. They are your spiritual ancestors in the world of learning. They paved the road you walk on, and they did it because they believed that to know the truth would set you free. That is the legacy. That is the gift. And it is a gift that keeps on giving to every generation that opens its eyes to see.